Welcome to Yoga Hype and History. Today we're going to be talking about Siddha Yoga and its charismatic founder, Swami Muktananda. Now, Siddha Yoga is a little bit different from some of the other organizations we've been looking at recently with modern postural yoga, and that modern postural yoga isn't their big thing. On the other hand, they do modern postural yoga. And in fact, I would argue that they are more traditionally in the line of traditional hatha yogis and traditional Indian gurus than the gurus we've seen thus far when looking at the Mysore school. So the yoga of Siddha Yoga and Swami Muktananda as a charismatic guru. First and foremost, it's a 20th century movement that has spanned into the 21st century, but it's lost a lot of its juice in the 21st century, but it's still going on. All right, so here we go. Today I will be discussing a guru named Swami Muktananda. His name means he who lives in the bliss of liberation, Mukta Ananda. And he created an organization called Siddha Yoga, which, after several transformations, remains existent today under a female guru named Gurumai Chidvilasananda. Trigger warning, I am going to talk about sexual abusers at some point in this chapter. All right, so let's look at this lineage right here. At the top, you have Swami Nityananda, and I'll explain these a lot more carefully. Swami Nityananda lived in a small village in Western India, and he was the guru of Swami Muktananda, who you see right at the center. Swami Muktananda was actually part of a traditional group called the Dasnami Swamis. So he was a renunciate. He had left the world, as are all the gurus we're going to be taught here. So Swami Muktananda has two kind of guru things going on, not unlike Krishnamacharya. So we have Swami Muktananda has Swami Nityananda, this charismatic figure that they called an avadut, one who acts strangely but is completely immersed in the bliss of liberation. He would almost always be naked, in fact. And then you also have this traditional group of swamis to which Swami Muktananda was a part of, and he was officially a renunciate. So then you have Swami Muktananda, and he becomes a somewhat moderately interesting god man or sort of, guru teacher in India. But when he came to the United States on a couple of world tours, he got big in the US for a while. Now, he set up two successors, but he wasn't really thoroughly clear on that. You have Swami Chidvilasananda, who goes by the name Guru Mai, and you also have Mahamandaleshwar Nityananda, another guy named Nityananda. Now, in fact, it seems like Muktananda wanted Nityananda, the second coming Nityananda, to be the guru that was ahead of the tradition, but it didn't work out that way, as we read about in our reading, and it ended up being Swami Chidvilasananda, or Guru Mai, who becomes the main guru of Siddha Yoga to this day. So one of the things I want to make clear, though, is when Swami Muktananda initiated these two, Guru Mai and Nityananda, who were brother and sister, he was initiating them almost into his own order. They didn't really become Dasnami Swamis in the way that he did. Well, perhaps the brother did, but the sister obviously could not because they weren't taking female gurus at the time. And when Muktananda and Swami Chidvilasananda have made Westerners into Swamis, they've been sort of initiated into this new line of a religious order that's based on Siddha Yoga. All right, so I have contact with quite a few scholars and devotees associated with this tradition. And in fact, I was even somewhat a follower myself of this tradition for a certain time in the late 90s and early aughts. Why? Because I was really interested in the philosophy of the Shaivism of Kashmir, which is a sort of tantric non-dualism that I originally found through reading philosophy texts, but then I found there was this group that was kind of doing it, and I found out right away that my teacher, John Grimes, had lived at the ashram in the United States for many, many years. Once upon a time, though he was never fully like a devotee of Swami Chidvilasananda, of Guru Mai. And then I found out that the professor that came before him at Michigan State University is a longtime devotee of Siddha Yoga and is still a meditation teacher actively. So there's a lot of academic connections. And I would even argue that you kind of scratch a lot of us South Asianists that are interested in Tantra, and you'll find some connection to Siddha Yoga. They've been very influential on the field. Now, Swami Muktananda was not a guru of modern postural yoga. such as we've seen before. He advocated for yoga for health. He thought modern postural yoga was a good idea, but that really wasn't his thing. We'll see later that there was one of his devotees, a guy by the name of John Friend, created a sort of hybrid of Siddha Yoga and modern postural yoga that he called Anusara Yoga. And we'll talk about that in the next module explicitly. But if Swami Muktananda, whose name means he who delights in liberation, was a yoga guru who did not teach modern postural yoga, then how is he a guru in general? Well, I would argue that he deploys the model of transnational missionary yoga from India. He is a transnational missionary yoga from India, packaging himself as bringing a new form of Hinduism or an ideal religion based on Hinduism that would appeal to Westerners. Who's this also sound like? It also sounds an awful lot like Swami Vivekananda. Unlike Swami Vivekananda, Muktananda never had a huge pan-Indian following, and his followers to this day are limited to those kind of around his ashram in India who are Indians and the areas around his ashrams, and mostly Westerners. Also, like Swami Vivekananda, his guru, Muktananda's guru, was a guy named Nityananda, who was a renuncier guru who was really charismatic. So Ramakrishna was illiterate. Nityananda was probably illiterate. He was considered this charismatic, sort of exciting, mystical guru. And then he had this follower who wasn't exactly thought of in the same way, who became a grand missionizer and then became a great spiritual person of himself. In the same way, Nityananda, as you see here at the bottom, seated, was very charismatic. And even when I go to areas of India today, people still talk in revered terms of him as a great saint. They don't quite speak in the same way as Muktananda. So both Swami Muktananda and Swami Vivekananda were renouncer gurus who had joined some sort of a religious order who came to bring something new to the West. Muktananda, in fact, taught a form of yoga that was connected to Tantra philosophy, and it actually looks really similar to the Raja Yoga of Swami Vivekananda, and you could even say maybe the Yoga Sutras, even though I don't think he ever really wrote about the Yoga Sutras. I'd be curious about that. So in a way, we're looking at something different in these figures. Swami Muktananda is like Swami Vivekananda part 2, but not as awesome. And he's a really interesting figure, but he's really different from Pattabhi Jois or Iyengar, neither of whom were renunciates. Krishnamacharya was not a renunciate, even though he was a part of a religious order. These guys were renunciates. They'd left the world. They had taken initiation, sannyas, and in sannyas, you change your name and renounce your family. So you've really left the world. One interesting thing about Muktananda is he associated with a lot of scholars, academics, and artists. We'll see Andrea Jain writes that he was an entrepreneurial guru seeking a meditation revolution around the world. He had in mind to set up centers and gain devotees and set down roots worldwide, not just in India, all over. He was very successful in the United States, to some degree in India, to some degree in Australia, and to some degree in South Africa. So in that way, despite him not being a native English speaker, it was very much Anglophone in the same way that we've talked about in the world of people speaking English. So he would do this thing that he called Shaktipat, which is an old idea, but he really popularized it. It means the descent of grace. And what he would describe this as a cultivated mystic experience that he could impart to people. And by imparting this Shaktipat, this descent of grace to people, those people would become awakened and they would become devotees to him and to Siddha Yoga. As devotees did this, they became sort of like Hindus. Remember, Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois and whatnot really didn't have spiritual teaching. They're like, do this for health. Hinduism's kind of awesome. You do you. Well, in this way, people who followed these gurus actually became Hindus. And I will note that Swami Vivekananda and his order initiated a lot of Westerners. In the late 90s, I met an older white gentleman who joined Vivekananda's order, I think in the 1960s, and had been doing it for 30 some years. He had renounced the world and was a part of a guru lineage stretching right back to Swami Vivekananda. All right, so unlike other so here's my point about scholars. This is an interesting thing that happened in the 90s. This book came out called Meditation Revolution, which is a history and theology of the Siddha Yoga lineage. This was written, these are like big scholars, Douglas Brooks, Paul Muller Ortega, Bill Mahoney, Constantina Rhodes Bailey. These were like well-known established scholars at the time, but they were also devotees. So they wrote this big book that was supposed to be like a history, a critical history, and an explanation of the theories of Siddha Yoga. They even got Gerald Larson, who's like an expert in Sankhya, to write some things. And then in the end, the book came out, and all the scholars were like, "You hoodwinked us. This isn't a critical. This isn't a critical edition, and it's not a critical history." And what we feel like we're actually seeing here is you all, as scholars, trying to consciously shape this tradition that you're actually insiders in. So the relationship with scholars can get a little funky sometimes. So, like I said, he was a renunciate, Muktananda was. So, unlike the other gurus we've examined, he was not only a renouncer, but he had an affiliation with the renunciate order, namely the Saraswati Dasanamis, that I pictured here in the center. And you can see that when he initiated his two disciples here, you have a picture of Swami Nityananda on top, and you have Muktananda there. And that's Nityananda and Guru Mai Chidvilasananda when they were initiated. And you see, they kind of look like renunciates, but I don't think they actually maintain the order with the Dasnami Swamis. I don't know for sure. That's something I need to look into a little bit more, but it wasn't something that I ever heard them really talk about. So what is Siddha Yoga? Well, Siddha Yoga, and what the yoga of Siddha Yoga, is a method for being religious. And, well, how would one be religious? Well, one of the big things they did was they chanted bhajans, which are praise songs that are like mantras, and they're sung in Sanskrit, but they have just fantastic, almost like rockin' music to it. They're really, really nice. And there were also Sanskrit sources that would be chanted, like this Guru Gita, which is a text of several hundred verses to praise the guru and the figure of the guru just in general. And it's an older text that we find in Maharashtra, but it's not an ancient text. And in the ashrams, there would be places where there would even be Vedic chanting. All right. So also we have this empowerment or initiation called Shaktipat. This is when the descent of grace would come from the guru to the future devotee, and the guru's grace would begin to awaken the kundalini within one. And they use that very term of the awakening of the kundalini through the grace of the guru. They also had what are called intensives, which were immersion courses. They started these in the 1970s. So you would go over 3 days or 1 day, and there would be lectures by scholars, other devotees that would give inspirational talks about whatnot. There would be a lot of music and chanting. And then the guru would show up toward the end after you've been chanting all day, and he would wander around, or later Guru Mai would bring people up in a reception line, and Swami Muktananda would bonk people on the head with a thing of feathers, and people would watch them. They'd freak out, and they'd feel this awakening experience. So that's that powerful charismatic thing. They also established community meditation centers all over the United States. They talked about this Shaktipat being the awakening of Kundalini, which we've talked about in several mystical contexts. Also, they had a meditation practice. And this is actually, I think, a key point. You would meditate as the self as yourself as God, but also as everything in the universe as being the play of consciousness, and also itself inherently being God. And this is really interesting, Swami Muktananda would always talk about the essence of the soul and the essence of existence as being a shimmering blue pearl, like a tiny thing that has the entirety of consciousness in it that one can see in one's heart or in one's mind, but one can visualize in meditation, which sounds really similar to a traditional Hatha Yogi thing when they would talk about the essential person, the essential highest person, the Purushottama, your highest identity, as being a tiny little thing in your heart, like where your soul really is. So that's a carryover. All right, so this sort of parallels Hatha Yoga, describing the essential person that is located in the heart, that is the true inner essence of the individual, and is also identical with God. He argued consistently that people should be the best at everything they do. And while some people excelled at music, other people excelled at yoga. So the yoga people doing modern postural yoga, would regularly teach in Muktananda's ashrams, and they taught a very high level of very polished yoga because they thought very highly of yoga. So there's that synthesis of modern postural yoga now has a religious underpinning, or overpinning, as you like to see it. All right, Siddha Yoga is non-renunciate. That's one thing I want to bring up. They have some people that have renounced under these gurus, but for the most part, it's geared toward lay people. And its most important aspect is this Shaktipat, the descent of grace, and types of meditation that are thought to steadily unfold Kundalini to bring about liberation. So let's look at a little bit about what is charisma. So we have this word charisma, and Max Weber, I wrote Max Weber, but Max Weber, the classical sociologist, a German guy, said that charisma is a certain quality of an individual's personality by virtue of which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. And he's talking about a charismatic figure in a religion. A charismatic teacher or guru has more than just good ideas or compelling rhetorics. He has power. He has this juju. He has this mojo that is more than his words and his teachings, but is found in his very presence. They are predominantly male, and I could list them forever. It is not necessarily that magical things happen by or around the guru, though that sometimes may be the case, such as with people like Satya Sai Baba, who would regularly perform miracles that look an awful lot like stagecraft to me. A charismatic leader may be exceptional or a compelling speaker, but it's the way these teachers and gurus speak is important as what they say. They drew people to them. And that presence and that performance of the way they would speak and the way they would teach would add weight to the message. The medium, as Troy McClure, or as McClure might say, Marshall McClure might say, the medium here may be the message, that it is beyond the content. But what do you do with gurus? Well, you have to find a way for them to exist after they die. So when a teacher or a founder dies, that charisma must be somehow preserved. So how do you do that? You can make up priests and clerics and renunciates and people that can carry on the tradition. You can make sure to write down everything they've said and then turn the things that the guru said into a type of scripture. You can have art and architecture. You can build temples. You can put pictures of them around. You can even have religious law and customs that are set up by the guru. So in any group that's a new religious movement, NRM, or thing where you're dealing with a charismatic leader like a guru, what I think is important to remember is there's always three levels of people involved in any of these organizations. You have the ordinary members who just attend a thing every now and then, go to like have been once or twice to an intensive, know some people. They're just around, ordinary members. These people generally don't know what's going on in the organization, and they really aren't part of the organizations. They're the audiences of the organization. Then you have advanced disciples. These are people who have been members for a long time and are considered to be kind of middle level to high ups in the religious order, but are not necessarily like the leaders and organizers. And finally, you have the founder and the inner circle. The problem is that the level one folk don't see the whole picture of what's going on. They just kind of see the sort of cool stuff. Like if you go to Scientology, you're mostly an ordinary member until they start drafting you to start recruiting people and working in the Sea Org. But that's a whole other thing. Anyway, so the advanced disciples are more complicit and invested in the group. So if you've been there for a long time, you'll start to be like, I'm seeing the founder and inner circle doing these funky things, but this is a really good thing we're doing. So I'm going to kind of look the other way or put a spin on it or try to make it, cool. But even if it doesn't seem cool, these are the people that really can enable when you see sexual abuses happening or sexual impropriety. These are the people that actively are looking the other way. Then you have the founder and the inner circle who are isolated usually from the ordinary members and only will really interact with the advanced disciples and the other inner circle. So this hierarchy can be maintained by levels of attainment. This hierarchy can be maintained by levels of attainment or just by simple social engineering. What I mean to say is you can have an ordinary member that becomes in the inner circle, not necessarily by becoming all that spiritually intriguing, but by sticking around and showing loyalty. Other ways, people will rocket through the ranks because they are spiritually advancing. Other times, people in the inner circle and founder may court people, especially academics and very successful people like artists and whatnot, and will move them through the ranks very quickly to become advanced disciples because the order wants something from them, which is always a little creepy for me. All right, so what about the life of Swami Muktananda, who lived from 1908 to 1982? Now, Andrea Jain, who we read today, argues that Muktananda was a very modern guru. He crafted his organization and his ideology, i.e. Siddha Yoga, for a transnational and Western leading audience. He taught us sort of modern Tantra yoga. We're back to Tantra here. So he takes Tantra scriptures and is like, this is the stuff we're working on. Abhinavagupta, the great Tantric thinker, he digs. Muktananda isn't like a Hatha yogi who's just like, well, we have that subtle body and that kundalini and whatnot, and that's kind of Tantra, but don't worry about it. No, they accepted that they were coming out of Tantric scriptures. So at the same time, he was a traditional guru and a sadhu and a tantrika. He did, toward the end of his life, secretly perform sexual yoga. These practices are denied by Siddha Yoga to this day, but I have no doubt they are true. His successors struggled to continue to maintain his charisma. The fact of the matter is, Nityananda was powerfully charismatic. He just pulled people to him. Muktananda was pretty darn charismatic, and he would go all over the world, and people would be compelled by him. Guru Mai took over, and I met her. She's impressive, but she's not like like Nityananda is like an atom bomb of charisma. But so Guru Mai really presents a very subtle and elegant and very modern, very female and sophisticated version of something, when Nityananda was just like, he's like a naked cowboy explaining how to find the truth. So in general, as your gurus get a little bit more polished, it's hard to maintain the level of raw charisma, just in general. So what is the Siddha Yoga doctrine? The doctrine, first and foremost, is that the guru, the teacher, the lineage holder, can confer Shaktipat, this descent of Shakti. And then through the guru's grace, this Shakti, or that feminine divine energy, will gradually unfold in the devotee over time, leading to eventual liberation. God, the guru, consciousness, and the totality of everything are all immediately accessible. And God can be found within the self. This is really interesting to me. So the notion of God being found within the self, and this general idea of God and the self and the totality of existence all being one unified thing, this was packaged as everything from neo-Christian mysticism to philosophical non-dualism to American transcendentalism. This was immediately accessible. Americans liked this type of thinking, especially in the 1970s. If you just look at the writings of Alan Watts at the time, who was popularizing almost every blend of mysticism you can imagine, and you look at the popular press of the day that was about Sufis and holy men and whatnot, the United States was ready for wisdom, and it was ready for a wisdom that was different than the common dualities of Christianity. And they were most happy to take that wisdom from the East, from charismatic gurus who come from India. Okay. So one Swami in the order actually one time told me when I was in India, somebody sat me down with him. I can't remember his name, but I talked to him for quite some time. He said that he didn't do any spiritual practice anymore. He said he met Muktananda, got the Shakti pot, and he's like, I don't need to do spiritual practice. I just run all this stuff and make everything happen. I'm like, well, but isn't the point to get liberation? He's like, oh no, the liberation is happening. While I sleep, all the Kundalini unfolds. I do all my meditation while sleeping. And I'm like, boy, that's convenient. Anyway, so the Kundalini, as it awakens, that coiled serpent energy we've talked about before, is thought to bring about realization of non-duality, that all things are just consciousness experiencing itself, and that all there is God. So Shaktipat has elements of the guru entering and changing the disciple. The sexual imagery is obvious, though it is unsaid. The descent of energy moving through the guru into the disciple, implanting something in the disciple, causing a change that gradually unfolds within the cycle. The sexual images, the reproductive images are all just kind of right there, and are very male-oriented, even though they have a guru who is female now. The best way to experience these so-called Shaktipats was by going to an intensive. That could be a week or a weekend or a day of chanting and teaching. And after all of the chanting and teaching, you would have an encounter with the guru, and Shaktipat would happen. Now, I would like you to note that intensives, even from the 70s, are paid for. But the gurus that I really noticed, I've never been to an intensive, but in my times around Siddha Yoga, I could always get access to the gurus just by going to their public addresses, where they would have what they call darshan, which is where everybody stands in a line. You go and you stand up, and you put your hands together, and you look at the guru, and the guru looks at you, and you have a moment. This is like when you go to a Hindu temple. It's the same thing with a darshan. You go in, you line up, you go and you stand in front of God for a few seconds. You look at God, God looks at you, and you have a moment. It's very similar. It's called darshan. And one of the ways Shaktipat can happen is by the glance between the eyes of the guru and the disciple. Okay. So what about Muktananda's life? He was born into a wealthy family, but as a boy, he met the god Nityananda. Pictured here, I love these two pictures of Nityananda. So Nityananda, he who delights in infinity. It's a good translation. So he met Nityananda as a boy, and then he met him later as an adult. But in the meantime, Muktananda joined a sadhu order called the Saraswati order. Oh, I don't have a slide on that. Okay. So under a specific guru named Siddha Swami. And then he took off and wandered India for 10 years, studying with gurus and going on pilgrimages, doing all sorts of things. And this way he was very much like a hatha yogi. He notes that throughout this time, he never really he was affiliated with the Dasnami Swamis, but I mean, he wasn't hanging out with any one specific guru group. So he re-encountered Nityananda, and when he met him, he considered Nityananda to be God himself. And he settled by Nityananda in a little place called Ganeshpuri, a lovely little jungle town, just sort of north and a little bit to the west of Mumbai. It's lovely. So Muktananda saw Nityananda as a god, but also he saw all of reality to be God. Yet Nityananda was also a guru who could bring about the insight of God. So you see that there are almost levels of divinity going on. Nityananda, according to Muktananda, was said to be a Siddha. Siddha means a perfected one, and that connects him to an almost infinite eternal body of past perfected ones. There's an idea like all of the Siddhas, those who have been perfected and liberated, they can materialize at will, they can be immaterial, you can see them in visions, they can help you out like personal angels, but they are realized beings. And when you talk to people in Siddha Yoga, they'll talk about their gurus being Siddhas, but then they'll also talk about there being just like these innumerable Siddhas that are all around and non-physical that one can make contact with. All right, Nityananda, at least Muktananda, argued that he would transmit the power and the lineage to Muktananda, and supposedly he did a ritual where he stuck his hand down his throat and gave him the Shaktipat power. This event is disputed, but Muktananda claimed it his whole life. A bunch of the Nityananda followers said that never happened, that Swami Nityananda saw Muktananda as being this weirdo with a shrine up the street, and he was just like, I don't really care about this guy. But Muktananda was like, this is God. Now I'm in the lineage, and I'm going to take Nityananda, and I'm going to take God to the world. So our next phase is propagation. So while in India, Swami Muktananda received a wide range of Indian and Western devotees. The people of Ganeshpuri have varied degrees. So Ganeshpuri is the town where the big ashram is in India, Sri Gurudeva Siddha Peeth, the glorious place that is the seat of the Siddhas. Okay, so the people of Ganeshpuri, and I've hung out with a lot of them, have varied degrees of love for Muktananda. And the more current Siddha Yoga, which is led by Guru Mai, they're not really all that happy with, because they feel like all of the Westerners coming have transformed their little jungle town into a cosmopolitan retreat site. Now, if you'll notice on the left, you can see the Siddha Yoga ashram, which is beautiful. And to the right, that's a hotel I've stayed in a bunch of times. So you can see the difference between what's going on in the town and what is going on at the ashram. And the people of the ashram are saying that they do all of this support to the town. I've seen none of that. And I've been walking around the outskirts of the town with kind of old school people, been there forever. And they're like, that was Nityananda's public hospital. And they show me this building that's all just beat down, but clearly used to be a hospital. And I'm like, what? And I was like, oh yeah, he got all this funds from people that would come, and he didn't want money. So he started this hospital here. And I'm like, well, why didn't Siddha Yoga and Muktananda keep it going? And they're like, yeah, why didn't they? Why didn't they? There's a big talk about around Siddha Yoga that they have a mobile eye clinic that goes around India helping people with eye problems for free, but I have my doubts. In reality, it becomes really insular. They've built this beautiful facility that only the most wealthy can get into. Meanwhile, you know, this town that gave birth to the tradition has very much been turned aside. In one hotel room where I stay, and I'm not going to show you a picture of that one, I've actually found that they have a secret room in which people do worship or puja to Nityananda. Now, that is a secret room in the sense that if you know the hotel owner, and if you're a devotee of Nityananda, you can get access to the services they do. I asked the owner several times, like, what's going on in that room? He's like, you don't have anything to ask about. I'm like, are you guys doing pujas in there? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I walked by one time and the door was open. They had a big, beautiful white marble statue of Swami Nityananda. And if you go to, there's a Swami Nityananda temple in town that's not associated with Siddha Yoga in any way. And every time I go in there, boom, it's like I'm listening to Pink Floyd or something. It's like really intensely beautiful. And I don't like to say stuff like this, but my meditations are very powerful. I can feel great energy there. And I do meet, at least in the 90s when I was there, I met a lot of people from Bombay who are Indians that like their fathers were like devotees of Muktananda, and they still really revered that place. And they especially revered this Nityananda temple. Okay. Muktananda claims that Nityananda, his guru, had a vision of an international yoga that would be spread everywhere. But Nityananda was really only interested in the immediate area and his immediate devotees and his own spiritual practice. We'll note that many gurus argue that their guru wanted to spread their yoga or their message to the world. Remember, Patabi Joy said Krishnamacharya wanted it spread to the world, but Krishnamacharya he was only vaguely interested in teaching Westerners. Or Vivekananda says that Ramakrishna wanted him to send this message to the world, but Ramakrishna clearly never said anything like that. All right, so what happened is they built this ashram that really resembled a Western-style retreat center rather than a traditional gurukul, a house of the guru, or an ashram. Ashram literally means a place of no work or no toil. Muktananda knew what he was doing. He knew that he was going to create this cosmopolitan world that would be very Western, but also have all the Eastern influences to keep it Indic, if you will. So Siddha Yoga sort of switched from being an Indian movement to a pan-Western movement that was very oriented toward the United States and Australia. It really appealed to urban Indians and Westerners who could easily access the guru's teachings, who could pay for an intensive, and who could go to the ashrams, and they could have those powerful religious experiences as mediated by those ashrams, but that would also bring in income. I'm not being crass here. You have to find a way to maintain your organization, and rich Westerners are a good way to get to it. Oddly, I met one young Indian one time who was very much into Guru Mai, and she referred to Guru Mai as her mother in many ways. And she was a young girl, and she talked about taking a little photo of Guru Mai, and she would put it like on her desk when she would take an exam. And a teacher came by and said, "Is this your mother?" And she said, "Yes." And she said, "Ha ha ha, yes, she is my mother." So the people that really come to Guru Mai, who you see on the left, tend to be very educated, very sophisticated Indians or Westerners. Now, Guru Mai is around. I mean, if you start digging around, she's still around. The most recent instance I noted was I watched an old movie by Wallace Shawn called My Dinner with Andre, which I do recommend. The whole thing is it's a dinner where this one guy meets another guy who's having a hard time, and he ends up at the end, the one guy who's having a hard time says that he's become a spiritual man, and he's seeing Guru, and he's a devotee of Guru Mai. There you go. So these intensives were and are filled with spontaneous kriyas. So what are kriyas? A kriya means an action that occurs sort of almost at random due to a spiritual thing that stimulates you. I know when I've been down in the Siddha Yoga catacombs, I found myself shaking and quaking, and I felt myself going into trance. And I can admit now, I mean, this is a very private experience, but I was watching Guru Mai on a monitor as she was leading a chanting session, and meanwhile around me, and all the Westerners were up there, and there was no translation down here. I'm surrounded by all the great people, but a lot of Indians. And I saw a couple of dudes get possessed and go into trance. I mean, I at one point looked up and I was looking right at her head, and like everything went pure white. And then I came forward, and all I could see is her singing, and her head looked like a skull to me, which was it wasn't scary. It was just deeply profound. I felt this connection. So, I mean, when you get in these situations, when there is this religious energy and you have a charismatic person at the head and people around who are freaking out due to that energy, it's easy to get pulled up into. And it's kind of fun to get pulled up into, in fact. I sort of recommend it. Don't join a cult, but maybe go hang out with a cult, you know? All right, so Shaktipat was available to anyone who had the money. So you can, as long as you could go to the intensive and you had an open heart, you would probably get a Shakti pot. Now, thinking about this, we as Westerners, and I know we're not all Westerners out there, but Westerners think in a way that is a very Protestant idea, that money should never be exchanged for spiritual services. All spiritual services should be free. Well, Indians don't have that. They just don't. Hindus do not have that idea. In fact, one of the things you supposedly do when you meet a guru is you give them a guru dakshina, a gift. You always give a money gift to the guru when they begin teaching you. Okay, so in general, these godmen and gurus sell a solution. They sell a solution to modern folks who are removed from family, village, and traditional contexts. So if you are an Indian or if you're a Westerner, when you just move to another place, move to a big city, you don't have your family, you don't have your traditional temple, you don't have the church that your family's always gone to. So you're looking for something. You're looking for a way to be spiritually grounded when you're out of context. Well, these godmen and these gurus in general can pop in and be like, just be with me. I'm the urban guy. I'm with you everywhere. So it allows a solution to modern people that feel disenchanted. In this way, these gurus sort of re-enchant the world. The testimonials of devotees' experiences with Shaktipat are a big part of regular writing in the Siddha Yoga. And if you look at their webpage, you can see this. There'll be lots of testimonials from devotees. Also, they continue to do intensive programming. And in general, personal testimonies, when you hang out with Siddha Yoga people, are treated almost like witness statements in the Protestant tradition, where they'll tell you about how they came to God, came to the Guru. This Shaktipat experience, the descent of grace, sets Siddha Yoga apart from all the other spiritual groups. It is an accessible mysticism that effectively connects the practitioner to the extinguished Tantra traditions of the past. Shaktipat is depicted as something oh so rare in the past, so it is a great treasure being made available to the public through the grace and generosity and magnanimousness of the Guru, of course. Whether by the Guru, and you're going to the okay, so I'm just not even gonna bother with that statement. Okay, so while they mostly practice, as far as their philosophy, is sort of Neo-Vedanta Hinduism, they also draw from tantric scriptures. And for those in the know, there's a sense that the tantric rituals that we talked about earlier are still there lurking underneath the teachings, but they're almost secretive about it. So Muktananda toured and lived in the USA among in three periods, once in 1970, then from 1974 to 1976, and then from 1978 to 1981. Eventually, he set up shop in New Fallsburg, New York, where the ashram, albeit a diminished version of it, still remains to this day. Of interest here is these yoga ashrams in the United States and also in India that maintain family ritual practices of Smarta Brahmins. So I'm talking about authority again. This means that they'll take local Brahmin families and be like, you don't have to become Siddha Yoga people, but come and do Vedic ritual just on our grounds, and we'll support you. Also, there is the Muktabodha Indological Research Institute, which came out of an earlier sort of teacher support network. I needed slides on this, I'm sorry. So it used to be that at the ashram in New Fallsburg, they would put scholars up in residence if they didn't have like good academic jobs. Like, oh, you can come live with us, give teachings for free. We'll give you, a stipend. You can live and you'll be a scholar in residence. They also used to put out grants to support PhD research. They used to give out actually good sized grants for PhD research. And they still promote the digital preservation of Sanskrit sources. This is all found throughout the auspices of the Muktabodha Indological Research Institute. Also, as I said a little bit above, should a scholar study Tantra, they likely have some contact currently or in the past with Siddha Yoga. So they infiltrated the academy, which is what so many religious groups in the 20th century tried to do. I mean, if you look at so many new religious movements, they were always trying to appeal and get scholars to convert. But this group actually had that happen. Why did it actually happen, though? Because you had all these scholars who had been reading about all these tantras and they'd always wanted to practice it, but there were no gurus out there. Suddenly you had a guru who could give you access to the tradition so you could actually do this religion that you've spent your whole life learning about. So I talked a little before about that book, Meditation Revolution. Some scholars were really critical, and some were really angry. And this book, which I kind of like, caused a great ruckus because people felt that these scholars were shaping the tradition and by being too much of insiders. So Muktananda had some sex scandals. So he had sexual practices with a number of women and young girls at the end of his life. We don't have a lot of evidence of him being an active raper man, but that doesn't matter. So what he would do is he would coerce women in one way or another, though he wasn't violent. He did give expensive gifts, and he was specifically interested in young girls. What he would do is and I'm going to talk about sexual mechanics here, he would actually insert himself into a woman and he would just remain there unerect. He would not get an erection for a very long time. Theoretically, what he was doing, he was pulling out feminine energy from the women to gather power, perhaps to keep him alive, perhaps to give power towards his religious vision. Now, the thing is about this is this kind of weird, because this is not something out of the blue. We have we have texts that describe these types of ritual activities in the tantras. So in a way, what was happening here is he denied, when facing the crowds, that he was doing all this kind of hardcore tantra, but in private he was doing it. Why was he doing it? My guess remains that he was arguing that he was doing this and he was not ejaculating. By not ejaculating, he was maintaining his his celibacy, but he was doing it to gather energy, I would argue, to remain alive when he was very ill. Muktananda, in fact, told a story about a guru who was critiqued for surrendering himself with women. Then he ejaculated into a bucket, blah, blah, blah. Then he ejaculated into a bucket and reabsorbed all of it through his penis. The point here is that sexual activity can still be continence without ejaculation. And there are further practices where a man sucks vaginal blood and vaginal fluids into himself to turbocharge his seminal retention practices. This is called the Vajrayana mudra. Muktananda told this story as a way to say that you can't really judge a guru. You can't really judge a guru or a siddha. That's, convenient for him. I see him telling this story as a tacit endorsement of tantra yoga and sexual practices. So what about his succession? Liz Harris wrote a long piece in the New Yorker, which I've put up for you to read today, called "Oh Guru, Guru, Guru," describing the problems for Siddha Yoga in a modern age. Sex scandals had happened, and they were made public. This led to doubts about Muktananda's message in general, but it also led to the community, and this isn't talked about in a lot of the agreed literature, but it has been documented. In the community, a lot of people started experimenting with sex, even renunciates. So people, while it was a relatively chaste spiritual organization, after Muktananda died and they found out about these sexual revelations, there are other people like, well, if the guru was doing it, we should be doing it too. This means that the devotees were claiming that the sexual materials and the sexual practices were inherent to the order. They pulled up the tantra roots as they encountered, they pulled from tantra roots that they encountered through reading scholarship, and they started doing these rituals on their own. Now, as this was occurring, right before he died, Muktananda declared that there were a brother and a sister who were supposed to be co-heads of the order. Neither had the same level of accomplishment or charisma as Muktananda. At initiation, though, the brother was named Nityananda, the sister was named Gurumai Chidvilasananda. Chidvilasananda ended up gaining power. She noticed that there were all these problems with sexuality. In fact, her brother had violated his celibacy vows by sleeping with other devotees. She orchestrated him being falsely imprisoned, beaten by his accusers, and then expelled from Siddha Yoga, and now you will never find any mention of him or pictures of him around in any Siddha Yoga literature or depictions. However, he started an ashram down the block. He's still out there in New York, and he's still bringing in people and doing his own thing. Okay, so it ought to be noted that she is the current head of Siddha Yoga, but she has very little involvement with the daily actions. She sort of has stepped back, so she's a guru figure. And when I encountered her in the 90s, she was still giving a lot of lectures and attending things. She's just continued to pull back as she's gotten older. And she said it's because being a Shaktipat guru is actually painful to her because she feels so much energy flowing out of her body when she gives Shaktipat. Okay, she reshaped Siddha Yoga as a more conservative neo-Hindu tradition that was Tantra, but did not have any hardcore sexual elements. Now, Nityananda was harassed for years. He was met by Siddha Yoga people protesting and even attacking him and his devotees. Guru Mai may or may not have ordered this, but she was witness to approved of it. Nityananda has been erased from Siddha Yoga culture. Years later, after Nityananda had been drummed out, he renewed his vows, set up his own modest ashram in upstate New York. Nityananda makes a really interesting argument, though, that I kind of wanted to close this on. Nityananda says that Indians will ignore 50% of what a guru says in favor of doing what needs to be done in the world, going, yeah, the guru says, I mean, come on, you got to be worldly. What do these gurus really know? So an Indian will just ignore 50%, probably more like 25, well, probably only accept like 25% of what a guru says. But he argues that Westerners, when they meet a guru, they 100% submit to that guru, playing into some old Indic ideals, but redoing it in a new way. So Hindus will argue that you must completely submit to the guru, and they have all these stories about completely submitting to a guru and doing everything the guru says, but in practice, they don't do that. In the United States, people would hear those ideals, meet a guru, and then they would be like 100% accepting of anything the guru would do. Nityananda says that this is what leads to these abuses by gurus and devotees doing troubling things to support the guru. And I think there's something about that. When we look at the way Westerners follow gurus almost unknowingly, and you can watch innumerable documentaries on this, I especially like Wild Wild Country about Rajneesh. They just completely like, this is it, I'm doing everything. But Indians are like, nah, all right, that's kind of interesting. I'll listen, whatever. So that's an interesting point. So there's a rivalry, there's a revolution. You can see the two ashrams. The one at the bottom on the right is the Siddha Yoga ashram. The one above it is a good size house, and that's where Nityananda is doing his thing now. They're all out in New York. Now, we are going to talk a little bit next module about a guy named John Friend. John Friend was a teacher of modern postural yoga in Siddha Yoga, and what he was able to do is take Siddha Yoga and merge it with modern postural yoga, but it was mostly the modern postural yoga, which is what he was teaching. He was teaching modern postural yoga all over the United States and all over the world, and was really, really famous. And what happened was he got into a little bit of trouble, and we'll talk about that later. But what he had done is he had managed a way to take all of like the religion of Siddha Yoga and then add on top of it his own background as a Midwesterner coming out of like a hippie context. So he was also really into eclectic neo-paganism. He put all of that together into a thing called Anusara Yoga, and he'd go around and teach modern postural yoga and would also teach this sort of general neo-Hinduism that was really derived from Siddha Yoga. And in fact, he had at least two bigwig scholars, Paul Muller-Ortega and Douglas Brooks, who would go to these things and would support him. And Paul would teach meditation, and Doug would teach philosophy and yoga as well, because Douglas Brooks is a very accomplished yogi. So the funny thing about this is I even had a former partner of mine, as we were talking one time, she told me about meeting Douglas Brooks at an Anusara yoga event. And I went to a couple of Anusara places, and I remember saying to the people working there, I'm like, so this is Siddha Yoga, right? I'm like, no, it's not Siddha Yoga. We just teach yoga here, but we also have these books on philosophy. I'm like, these books are all Siddha Yoga. How are you not Siddha Yoga? I mean, they even had like an Anusara yoga center and an organic coffee shop in my hometown of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And they were pretty sketchy when I'd go in there and start asking questions. Okay, so what? So we have yoga gurus as lineage bearers. This is different. I mean, Pattabhi Jois and Iyengar, they did not care to be, I mean, they were lineage bearers of the Krishnamacharya yoga tradition, but they weren't associated with another larger like guru order. And we don't see people that are members of those guru orders appealing to sophisticates and Westerners. Now, I keep arguing that what is yoga and what is the study of yoga, but it's a tracing of the history of ideas about experimenting on the mind and body to grant about perfection, spiritual liberation, or magic powers. So here again, we see a space where there's an experimentation. We see yoga, and the thing about all of what's going on in Siddha Yoga is they were constantly teaching modern postural yoga classes all the time. So it made a lot of sense when John Friend said, let's just put all this together. So they were able to hijack modern postural yoga as this thing for health that was also Indian, that must also be identical to the mental yogas that Swami Muktananda was teaching. one more second. Okay. So they in fact carried on traditions of traditional gurus and hatha yogis in a brand new context. So unlike Joyce or Iyengar, Muktananda had people join a tradition, not the tradition of his order, but his own tradition, and become sort of like white Hindus. That was something that Iyengar and Joyce were like, no, you don't need to practice religion, just do this for health. So they took up the context of yoga, just like modern postural yoga took up the physical culture of Mysore, got involved, and then blew up modern postural yoga within it. It's like Siddha Yoga looked at modern postural yoga, jumped in there, put their philosophy in it, and hijacked and moved forward as well, because yoga is always about transformation. So we have charismatic figures that become the heads or inspiration for new religious movements. So new religious movements is another word for a cult. When I say cult, I mean charismatic religious groups that use high control behavioral structures. In other words, they use high control. They try to structure every minute of your day, every minute of your mind, with charismatic leaders who at root engage in antisocial activities. I do a whole class on that. Anyway, so that's a new religious movement. All right. So the meditation and the esotericism within Siddha Yoga is really similar to the sort of yoga of Vivekananda, the yoga of meditation that was such a big deal. And sort of like the other figures who were found in early 20th century yoga that did not advocate physical yoga, people like Shivananda and whatnot. So this is very much in the vein of that. Muktananda was able to yoke together general Hinduism, Hindu philosophy or Vedanta, and also an expansive physical and non-physical yoga, charismatic godmen, and also disembodied scriptures. Disembodied siddhas. He also was able to yoke together the traditional tantras, the traditional scriptures. All this formed a new religion, in fact, called Siddha Yoga. And this was mostly directly put to a Western audience. Even when drawing large crowds, Muktananda had far more Western devotees. Some people saw this as a legitimating honor, and others saw this as him selling out and not being really Hindu or oriented toward Indians. Again, this is a form of yoga with a charismatic founder and lineage. But will yoga continue to have charismatic gurus like Muktananda, Joyce, Iyengar, or as we'll see, there are problems with John Friend? I would argue post-lineage yoga will not be connected to yogis and charismatic figures. The new yoga authorities and the new yoga innovators will be people with lots of experience who perform really well and who have skills that can impart a yoga methodology. However, they give that yoga methodology and they are going to, in the future, take authority from health, medicine, and science. They won't say, because the scripture says this, or because my guru says this. They'll say, because a scientific study on relaxation and stretching does this. Because we did research on pranayama timed with yogic body positions to have this cortisonal endocrinological changes. That's going to be the future of the authority of yoga. All right, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.